Good morning to you. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Friday morning. Hope you've had a good week. Hope you're looking forward to a good weekend. And thank you so much for joining us for our Bible reflection for today. And friends, today we're in Isaiah and chapter 38. Yet another fascinating chapter, this one. So without further ado, Isaiah 38, here goes. In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, came to him and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die, you shall not recover." Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord, "Remember now, O Lord, I implore you, how I have walked before you in faithfulness with a whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. And the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, "Go and say to Hezekiah, thus says the Lord, the God of your ancestor David, I've heard your prayer, I've seen your tears, I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and the city from the hand of the king of Assyria and defend this city. This is the sign to you that the Lord will do this thing that he has promised. See, I'll make the shadow cast by the declining sun on the dial of Ahaz turn back 10 steps. So the sun turned back on the dial the 10 steps by which it had declined." A writing of King Hezekiah of Judah after he'd been sick and had recovered from his illness. "I said, in the noontime of my days I must depart. I am consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years. I said, I shall not see the Lord in the land of the living. I shall look upon mortals no more, upon the inhabitants of the world. My dwelling is plucked up and removed from me like a shepherd's tent. Like a weaver, I've rolled up my life. He cuts me off from the loom. From day to night, you bring me to an end. I cry for help until morning. Like a lion, he breaks all my bones. From day to night, you bring me to an end. Like a swallow or a crane, I clamour. I moan like a dove. My eyes are weary with looking upward. O Lord, I am oppressed. Be my security. But what can I say? For he has spoken to me. He himself has done it. All my sleep has fled because of the bitterness of my soul. O Lord, by these things people live, and in all these is the life of my spirit. O restore me to health and make me live. Surely it was for my welfare that I had great bitterness. For you have held back my life from the pit of destruction. For you have cast all my sins behind your back. For Sheol cannot thank you, death cannot praise you. Those who go down to the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. The living, they thank you, as I do to this day. Fathers, make known to children your faithfulness. The Lord will save me, and we will sing to stringed instruments all the days of our life at the house of the Lord. And then Isaiah had said, to let them take a lump of figs and apply it to the boil that he may recover. Hezekiah also had said, what is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord? And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, the year is just over 700 BC. The place is Jerusalem, and the Hezekiah is the king at the time. Now, the chronology here is a little difficult because the events of chapter 36 and 37, the siege by the Assyrians, almost certainly happened after this, although this is mentioned afterwards in the Bible, so it's a bit confusing. But it's thought that this happened shortly before the siege of which we talked about the last couple of days. And Hezekiah becomes sick to the point of death. Anyway, as it happens, and Isaiah comes with the words he doesn't want to hear. You're about to die, so set your affairs in order, essentially, he says. And so that's what he does. And what's interesting here is about Hezekiah. Hezekiah, as we should find out today and on Monday, was a mixed character. He had some very good points and some very not so good points as well. But he was faithful to God. He did listen to God. He did have faith in God. And so as soon as he's told that he's become ill, he prays. And he says he turned his face toward the wall. And I think that's a sign that what that means really is, he wanted time alone with God. So he's told he's going to die. Okay, he's told to set his affairs in order, to get straight with God. And that's exactly what he does. And so he turns his face to the wall, so he's on his own with God, so he can properly do business with God. And he prays, and he prays hard. Interesting, actually, in verses in verse 3, the prayer is quite interesting. It's he doesn't, interesting, there's no humility here. There's no terribly sorry God for my sins and that type of stuff. It's quite interesting. You'll hear more about that later. In the end, it's to say, look, he's essentially saying to God, I've been faithful to you. I followed you all of my life. It doesn't look very good for you if I die. This case, that's the kind of way he's going. But nonetheless, he prays and he prays to God, and he throws himself onto, and he very much ties himself here with the honor of God. So far, Hezekiah has been told he's ill to the point of sick. He's told to get his affairs in order. So he does the right thing. He turns to God in prayer, and he reminds God that he's been faithful, and he puts himself very much in with the honor of God and says, look, in your honor, will you save me? Then in verses 4 and 5, 4 to 6, Isaiah is told by God to say, your prayer has been answered, and I'm going to extend your life by 15 years. And interesting here that God hears Hezekiah's prayer, and God answers it, and he gives him another 15 years of his life. So he's ill, he's prayed, God has heard, and God responds. And he has 15 years of his life. Now, the only thing with the 15 years, you'll hear more about this on Monday, is that the 15 years meant that he had a son called Manasseh, who went on to become the most evil king that people ever had. But more about that in a few days. So he's ill, he's prayed to God, put himself in the honor of God. God has answered, and God says he's going to be made better. Then he gets the funny bit, verses 7 and 8, when God gives Hezekiah a sign that he's going to do it, and the sign is essentially he's going to lengthen the day. So they didn't have watches in those days or clocks; they had sundials, and what effectively does is that the shadow on the sundial goes back, and it's a sign that God is going to lengthen the years of Hezekiah's life. He's going to give him more days. So likewise, to show that he's going to do that, he lengthens the day. God turns back the sun or something along those lines. That's essentially what's going on. This must be an amazing miracle, really. So God says, to show you I'm going to do this, I'm going to lengthen the day, and I'm lengthening this day to show that I'm going to lengthen your days. I'm going to give you 15 more years of life. So that's the overall story in verses 1 to 8, is that Hezekiah is ill, he prays, God hears, God responds, and God gives him 15 years to show he's going to do it. He puts back the sun to give him a length of day to show he's going to lengthen his days. Then what you have then for the rest of the chapter is verses 9 to the end. You have Hezekiah's reflection on what's happened. And you might call this theological reflection. This is him afterwards, looking back at what happened, about how it was going to happen. So you might call it his theological reflection. He looks back on his life and sees God at work in his life, okay? And as he reflects, he sees all sorts of things. He basically says in verses 9 to 13, he looks back and says, I was ill, I was really, really bad. I thought, I was consigned to the gates of Sheol, which is a kind of shadowed place where dead people go. I shall not see the Lord in the land of the living. So that's where he kind of got to, because he acknowledges in verses 9 to 13 that he's really ill, that he knew he was going to have his shepherd's stick taken away from him, and so he recognised that he was going to be ill, and that he was in a bad way because of it. Then in verses 14 and 15, he talks about how he turned to God, he moaned and was weary, so he looked upwards. O Lord, I am oppressed, be my security. And so he looks by you. So, beg your pardon, not putting this very well. In verses 9 to 13, he talks about that he was really, really ill, and he thought his desires for his life was going to end. In verses 14 and 15, he talks about how he looked to God and prayed to God that God would be his security. And it's obviously, these are obviously agonizing prayers that he had. He lost sleep and so on. And then in the rest of the verses 16 to 20, he talks about what happened then. He reflects on the fact that God made him better, that God spoke to him, God made him better. And afterwards, he reflects that, he says, verse 17, surely it was for my welfare that I had great bitterness, for you've held back my life from the pit of destruction. He looks back and he says, it was tough at the time, but I'm glad I went through it. And interesting, he says, for I had great bitterness. And I think actually when he was originally told he was ill, I think he probably wasn't in a very good place spiritually. And I think the illness made him turn to God. I think the illness made him get his life straight with God and pray to God. And his prayer that wasn't very good, it was not a lot of humility in there. a prayer of great bitterness, you might say, and that actually his illness made him turn to God and actually got his sins forgiven. And then later on, when the siege and so on, the attack that happened, hit about verses in chapter 36 and 37 we talked about last couple of days, he was actually in a better place spiritually to do that. So in this reflection, in verses 9 to 13, he says that he was going to be very ill. In verses 14 to 15, he talks about how he prayed to God. And in the end, he looks back and he says, it was tough, but I'm glad I went through it. God took away my sins because of it, took away my bitterness, and actually made me stronger. So he looks back and says, it was tough at the time, but I'm glad I went through it. And I'm sure that many of us can look back on our lives at times that have been hard in the past. You wouldn't necessarily want to go through them again, but in retrospect, you're glad you did, because God's worked through it and our faith was strengthened through it and we become better because of it. So in this chapter, we have firstly verses 1 to 8, the story of how Hezekiah was ill. He prayed to God, God answered, God healed him. And to show he's going to heal him, he did this amazing miracle by lengthening the day, to show he's going to lengthen his days. Then in verses 9 to the end, you have Hezekiah's reflection on what happened. He looks back on what happened afterwards and says, I was ill. Then in verses 14 to 15, I prayed to God in my distress. And in the end, in the last few verses, he looks back and says, actually, I'm glad I did. It took away my bitterness. It dealt with my sin. And now it's made me a better person. And that the experience of it has made me better and was actually put him in a better spiritual place later for the siege and the attack that came from the Assyrians later. So he looks back with thanks and says, thank God for that. You might say, in the words of St. Paul, Romans chapter 8, all things work together for good for those that love God. Even in this case, serious illness. Friends, have a lovely weekend. Thank you for watching. God bless you. Do please share this message with your friends. Have a lovely time. Hope to see you over